Bell Pottinger is one of this country's most prominent PR firms. Its founder, Lord Bell, has for many years been closely associated with the Conservative Party, and the firm has employed some senior Labour figures too. Today, the body which regulates the PR industry will meet to decide whether the company should be punished, perhaps expelled, for a campaign in South Africa which led to the resignation of the company's chief executive yesterday. Manveen Rana's been following this story closely and secured the first interviews with some of the principal players, and she's with me. Manveen, this is a firm that's looked after the reputations of some very prominent people and also some very controversial ones.
Yes, that's right. So when I spoke to Lord Bell a few weeks ago, one of the things he said was that the clients involved in this particular case, the Gupta family, were the first clients he felt he really couldn't defend, which I think a lot of people were quite surprised by, because they've certainly sort of had a long list of controversial clients in the past. You know, they famously represented General Pinochet when he was being held in Britain. Trafigura, the oil company, when they were involved in the toxic waste dump. Oscar Pistorius, when he was being charged with murder. Asma al-Assad, President Assad's wife. So they've been far from... their clients are often...
They're used to the headlines.
They are used to the headlines.
This is the first thing that's really got them into trouble. Just take us through the story.
Well, so that's perhaps one of the most surprising things, that this is the first case that's really sort of caused them huge trouble. And that's the case, they were hired by the Gupta family in South Africa, who are a family of industrialists. Within 20 years, they've moved to South Africa and managed to make billions. Many people in the country think this is partly because of the influence they exercise over President Zuma. They hire his son. And they're effectively accused of corruption on such a grand scale that it needs a whole new title. They're calling it state capture. They secure sort of government contracts. They're said to have the power to hire and fire ministers. And they've sort of managed to spread their tentacles into sort of every industry imaginable. You know, they own mines, media companies. They're all over the state. They hired Bell Pottinger to come in and do reputation management and a bit of corporate work, but also to launch a campaign on what they were calling economic emancipation. And this is basically encouraging black people to sort of seize economic power, which doesn't, in its own right sounds perfectly respectable. But basically the way the campaign worked was to distract attention from encouraging ordinary South Africans to blame their economic woes not on President Zuma or the government's economic policies, but to blame white businesses that had functioned in the country for an awfully long time. They called it white monopoly capital. And what we saw eventually were sort of protests on the streets, which were sort of calling for Zimbabwe-style land grabs. That there was violence against white people. There were people sort of campaigning outside the houses of white industrialists. I spoke to Nicholas Walpe out in South Africa, who runs a memorial to the anti-apartheid movement, and he accused Bell Pottinger of effectively undoing the work of Nelson Mandela and exploiting racial tensions in South Africa.
The ANC, in every single historical document you read, says South Africa cannot fulfill its full potential unless it creates a non-racial society where all South Africans participate. And Bell Pottinger has come in and stuck a knife into the heart of that very ethos and fabric by exploiting something that is extremely sensitive, and they've been malicious.
Now, this became a huge scandal out in South Africa. The Democratic Alliance, the opposition party, has been very good at sort of raising awareness of what was going on. And the company, Bell Pottinger, started to lose South African clients, and it found itself sort of in the headlines every day. There were protests on the street with people carrying placards with the faces of staff from Bell Pottinger at one point. And eventually, earlier this summer, the company sacked the employee who was in charge of the account and suspended 3 others. And they also launched an internal investigation by the company, the law firm Herbert Smith. James Henderson, the CEO, issued what he called an unequivocal apology. And he's resigned this weekend. But when I spoke to him a few weeks ago, he said his company's actions had really been misunderstood.
At worst, we were very naive in what we got involved with, but there was no, at any point, intention to create the impact that's claimed that we've been created. We went out predominantly with a corporate campaign trying to handle an issue in a responsible way, and I believe that will come out. However, I believe there was naivety and that we were involved in a very political situation. And we've allowed ourselves to become the story, but the actions we've been accused of, in time, I hope it'll come out that we did not do that. And we have been called guilty before any real evidence has been shown of what we did do. We clearly take huge concern at this, which is why we commissioned a Herbert Smith report to look into every aspect, every email, every document that was produced. The proposals I saw on this issue looked corporate responsible proposals. They did not fuel racial tension or have any intention of doing so.
Well, he, as you say, has just resigned, or resigned over the weekend. Where's the story now?
Well, we've now seen the results of the internal investigation by Herbert Smith, which, when I was doing the interviews, I was assured by James Henderson and various people from Bell Pottinger would prove that they were not guilty of many of the accusations. Now, one of the big accusations out in South Africa was that perhaps the company had been involved in creating Twitter bots, which had sort of led to a huge explosion in the term of white monopoly capital. The report does say that it hasn't seen evidence of that, but it does say that of the work that they were doing, they thought that some of it was inappropriate. It was negative, it targeted wealthy white South Africans and was potentially racially divisive. So they have been found guilty, effectively, of the racial tensions. It also, the report also sort of points out that they can't be certain that senior management knew about the detail of the work that was being done, but they should have been aware of the sensitivity of this account and therefore should have made more effort to be monitoring the work of those lower down, which is one of the things that we talked about at length. Now, this morning I've spoken to Lord Bell, who was one of the founders of the firm, who left over the problems in this account, and he says that James Henderson's resignation isn't quite enough.
The resignation doesn't solve anything. It simply adds to the confusion. He owns a large percentage of the company. He's no longer the chief executive. That's a particular job, but it doesn't resolve anything. It doesn't make anything go away, and it leaves a smell in the air.
Is it hard to detoxify the brand as long as James Henderson is still so closely associated with it?
I think it's virtually impossible to detoxify the brand as long as James is a large shareholder, and the other major shareholders have to look to their own relationship with it as well. I think it's very difficult to see how its future looks in any way positive.
Do you think the company can survive?
I think it's possible for it to survive. I think it's unlikely, but it's possible.
The Herbert Smith report that's been published today does sort of highlight that there wasn't enough oversight from senior management. Now, you were there for part of the time you held this account. Is that a criticism you recognise? It's
partially true. It's not completely true. It's not a complete picture. It says they didn't know the intimate detail of it. That may be true, but the broad thrust of it is there. It's not a whitewash as such, but it's as near to a whitewash as you can get.
That's Lord Bell. Now, we should point out that James Henderson did deny that he knew the detail of the account at the time, and the report does say they haven't seen evidence of that, but there should have been processes in place. Now, the question of whether the firm can survive is very interesting. As Lord Bell points out, James Henderson is still a very major shareholder. He and his fiancée own just under 40% of the company. That will be a problem with clients. When I spoke to him, James Henderson said they had already lost a substantial number of clients. I've been told that they've lost even more since that interview was done. They also seem to be hemorrhaging senior staff. James Henderson isn't the only resignation in recent weeks at the company. The PRCA, as we said, this is the trade body in charge of the PR industry, has had a hearing. I've been told they decided to expel Bell Pottinger, having found them guilty of having broken the ethics code of the committee. And it was supposed to be announced today. Bell Pottinger has appealed, but the final decision will be announced tomorrow.
Oh, Manvin. The former Labour Cabinet Minister, Lord Hain, Peter Hain, grew up in South Africa and was a prominent anti-apartheid campaigner. And you are with us, I think, aren't you? Good afternoon.
I definitely am, Ed. Nice to talk to you. And can I commend the programme for the way you have drawn attention to this scandal?
That's a great compliment to Manvin. Thank you very much for that. Let me put to you the same question. How much damage do you think it did in South Africa?
A lot of damage. was a pernicious campaign using fake Twitter accounts, spreading fake news. George Orwell's 1984.
Yeah, we should say we don't absolutely know that for sure, do we?
Well,
the question...
it is widely believed in South Africa that that is the case, and certainly there were fake Twitter accounts created, and certainly there was fake news spread, and the particular damning indictment of Bell Pottinger's role is that what they did is re-racialize, to use what some people have described as the situation, re-racialize South African politics by effectively targeting what they called white monopoly capitalists, and to the point where there was some ring of truth, because the economy is still largely controlled by the same largely white forces that ran it under apartheid, although with a large black complement now. And what it did was it resonated with people frustrated with the endemic corruption and cronyism which has now infected the country under President Zuma. And the Gupta brothers and the Gupta family, who are the president's close associates, employ members of his family and have been part of this whole conspiracy, which has actually been looting the country, shamefully betraying Nelson Mandela's legacy. But the frustration with that has then been diverted by this Bell Pottinger campaign to target particular white figures in this disgraceful, pernicious twisting of the truth.
Well, you clearly think it's a very serious matter indeed in that case. What do you think should happen now? Do you think the resignation of the chief executive is the end of it, or does more need to happen?
More needs to happen. Bell Pottinger should be closed down in South Africa, and I think every one of its contracts with public organizations in Britain and private bodies in Britain should be looked at again to see whether the same the upside down process of twisting the truth that their campaign ran in South Africa is now infecting their work in Britain. I've also tabled a series of questions to the government in the House of Lords. They're going down tomorrow when Parliament resumes, to find out what the government's attitude to this is, and whether Bell Pottinger consulted any government officials, particularly those on the ground in South Africa, of our representatives there, or here in Britain in this campaign, or whether government ministers or officials, having been aware of it, did anything to try and dissuade them from this really destabilizing role. South Africa's democracy is a young democracy. It was established after decades of struggle against this kind of anti-democratic elitism, and it has been subverted very badly by it.
In that connection, we're talking at a time, obviously, when the government is very anxious to build new alliances, new trade alliances, particularly in viewers leaving the European Union, with other countries. What impact do you think this will have on Britain's reputation in South Africa?
A damaging reputation, because this is a British-based company. It's a global operation, but a British company, essentially. And the uproar and outcry in South Africa, I was there teaching at the University of Witwatersrand recently, where I'm a visiting professor. It was palpable. People are deeply, deeply angry. Civil society protesting against the corruption and against the cronyism has found itself targeted by this campaign. A respected former finance minister, Pravin Gordhan, a struggle hero of impeccable integrity, was the target of Bell Pottinger's fake news operation, and eventually dismissed by President Zuma and replaced by a figure, the current finance minister, closely allied to the Gupta brothers. This is really serious perversion of the historic anti-apartheid struggle.
Lord Hain, thank you very much indeed for joining us.